Hello and welcome everyone. The year 2020 will remain surely in the annals of history as the great pandemic of modern times, with the emergence and spread of the coronavirus, first in China and then in the rest of the world. This highly infectious virus literally spread panic to virtually every country in the world, forcing half of humanity to shut itself away at home in one of the most comprehensive and stringent containment and quarantine measures in human history. To date, more than 2 million people worldwide are sick, and more than 100,000 deaths have been attributed to COVID-19, which continues to spread like a terrible shockwave, ready to bankrupt even the most developed and efficient health systems. The medical world has therefore been on the warpath since the beginning of this pandemic, seeking by all means to contain this viral threat. But while we know a little more about this virus with each passing day, the origin of its appearance is still rather unclear, especially since the wildest rumors about it are pouring out in torrents on social networks. For while it is commonly accepted that the coronavirus emerged in Wuhan, many people still believe that it escaped from a laboratory or that it is a biological weapon supposed to annihilate hypothetical enemies. Today, we are going to go back with you to the very obscure origin of the coronavirus and try together to understand how this terrible virus could have originated. We won't really need an electron microscope to discover the origin of the coronavirus, but rather a time machine, because we will start by going back a few months, to November 2019 to be more precise. The world is going about its usual business: yellow vests in France, general elections in Spain, political bragging rights and supremacists in Trump, and the United Kingdom preparing to slam the door on Europe. But in continental China, a mysterious evil is beginning to emerge, and the province of Hubei is probably its epicenter. It is precisely in the city of Wuhan, capital of the district, that the first victims of this mysterious disease appeared, a city with more than 11 million inhabitants, and which is therefore the seventh most populous city in the country. The Middle Kingdom was then in full swing in the preparations for the Chinese New Year, an extremely important celebration for all Chinese people. The few recorded cases of fainting in the streets and the first signs of a wave of pneumonia among the population of Wuhan therefore went almost unnoticed. However, the phenomenon will soon swell and become increasingly publicized as a steady stream of affected patients pours into the city's hospitals. However, it was not until the 12th of December that the alert was given by an ophthalmologist at Wuhan Central Hospital, Dr. Li Wenlang. This last report takes note of a concerning patient who shows a positive result with a high confidence interval for SARS coronavirus tests. Li Wenlang then shares his suspicions in a private conversation on the Chinese WeChat messaging system with his medical school graduate colleagues. In this message he states that there are currently 7 confirmed cases of SARS at the Huanan seafood wholesale market. He has also published the report and CT scan result of 1 patient. The same evening, he adds that the latest news confirms that these are coronavirus infections, but that the exact virus has yet to be subtyped, while also explaining in the message what a coronavirus is. For having acted thus in the purest medical ethics, Li Wenlang will be harshly reprimanded by the Chinese state, which accuses him of spreading false and unfounded rumors. A decision that will be strongly criticized later, when the Chinese, and then the rest of the world, when they discover that the doctor was right and that an epidemic was indeed smoldering at the time of the events in Wuhan. The doctor had made it clear that most of the cases had been reported at the Huanan wholesale seafood market, a wet market that, contrary to its name, does not only sell fish and seafood products. For although the Huanan market is known as a seafood market, it was mainly famous for sales of bush meat and other exotic animals, due to very strong consumer demand. A mess, in the stalls of this huge market of 50,000 square meters, you could find giant salamanders, crocodiles, marmots, but also civets or cubs, and even scorpions and scolopendra. These types of markets, nicknamed wet markets or sometimes also called live animal markets, are very popular in China, and more generally throughout Southeast Asia. Sheltering more than 1,000 traders, the Huanan market thus knew totally unhygienic conditions, with its narrow lanes and cramped stalls, as well as the presence of livestock living near the carcasses of dead animals. It was very common to see flayed animals, exposed in the open air, dogs, cats, and many other more exotic species such as the famous masked palm civet, a wild mammal, which many Chinese love its supposedly perfumed flesh. It is one of the 2 animals, along with the bat, particularly the species Rhinolophus affini, which are reputed to be a natural home for viruses of the coronavirus family. It was the masked palm civet and its consumption that was singled out in 2002 during the outbreak of the SARS epidemic, which infected more than 8,000 people and caused at least 774 deaths worldwide. The outbreak was declared extinct in 2004, with more fear than harm in the end, and its potential lethality was so frightening that governments decided to close most of Asia's wet markets. However, this was not going to last, because in the absence of strict and rigorous controls, and due to the blatant laxity of the authorities concerned, the reopening of these wet markets took place shortly after the official end of the epidemic. Although strongly criticized both for the exotic species sold, which are very often the result of illegal trafficking, and for the promiscuity of live animals of different species, which is highly conducive to the emergence of zoonoses, the wet markets will therefore continue to flourish. The one in Wuhan, in particular, had thus become the largest wet market in the whole of central China, attracting hundreds of thousands of individuals and professionals every day. But while SARS was caused by the masked civet, it turned out that for the COVID-19, it was in fact another animal that was the vector of this zoonosis, the pangolin, a small-scaled mammal. Despite its status as a protected species, the pangolin is nevertheless the mammal that suffers the most from illegal trade. In addition to the consumption of its flesh, its scales are also used in traditional Chinese medicine. Pangolin is also a natural source of coronavirus, and its trafficking and consumption encourage the emergence of zoonosis, i.e. the interspecies viral transmission from animal to human and vice versa. But how can we explain the consumption of such species which, in addition to appearing unfit for consumption, are potentially formidable pathogens? A simplistic explanation would inevitably return these food modes to a centuries-old Chinese tradition. The passion of the Chinese for eating wild animals is easily linked to the medicinal properties they attribute to these foods. Ancient medical writings attribute such virtues to almost all plants and animals, and even to animal organs, excrement, moods, skin and feathers. And it's true that Chinese medicine considers the medical art in food to draw from the same sources. However, while it is true that traditional medical practices in Asia can explain the consumption of these animals, this fact masks a much more disturbing detail: the new explosion of the market for so-called wild animals. This consumption of wild animals is not immutable, it has a history, and this history is recent. It can be divided into two parts. The first goes back to the 1970s. The Chinese regime had to deal with a famine that caused more than 30 million deaths and failed to produce enough food to feed its entire population, counting with 900 million people. It then decided to reform an agricultural system that until then had been completely nationalized. It authorized the development of private livestock farms. Small peasant farms, hard hit by famine, turned to wild animals, such as turtles, to try to survive. However, this remains very marginal, and the second stage of this story is probably much more decisive. In 1988, the Chinese government decided to define wild species as natural resources, thus paving the way for their exploitation by large capitalist farms for profit. It is from this date that the consumption of wild animals really began to explode. And it is at this time, and not before, that the discourse that emphasizes the medical benefits that consumers can expect to derive from the consumption of these animals fully develops. So, far from a discourse derived from traditional medicine, it is a banal commercial strategy produced by the large farms exploiting these species in order to increase the profits derived from the exploitation of this new, natural resource. As a result, there has been an expansion in demand, especially from the wealthy middle classes living in cities. Thus, pangolin and other so-called wild species have been the object of merchandising, integrating them into agri-food value chains. From this angle, pangolin seems much less strange to us than it was at the outset. It is in the end just another common commodity, except, of course, that the commodity in question is suspected of being the cause of a particularly dangerous pandemic. This process of merchandising obviously has a direct impact on the zoonotic process that produces new pandemics. Firstly, because in order to capture the animals to be sold, it becomes necessary to move into areas that are not easily accessible, increasing the risks of exposure of farmers to species carrying different viruses, such as bats. Then, because it involves placing virus-carrying species on the market to which the consumer's immune system can have no effective response since it has never been confronted with them. So, far from the conspiracy theories that flourish on the web, or the rumors of the creation of this virus in the laboratory, the truth is that the explanation of the origin of COVID-19 simply draws its sources from the foundation of present-day Chinese society. So, it is likely that when this epidemic is finally behind us, the wet markets will be back on their feet and with them their thriving economy employing nearly 1 million people. So, what did you think of the obscure origin of the coronavirus? Do you think the consumption of wild animals should be strictly forbidden in China? Were you surprised by the amazing way wet markets work? Give us your feeling in the comments.